Getting the fuselage pretty well assembled. I still have to do stuff, of course, putting the horizontal stabilizers on and the rudder and stuff like that. The big thing that I was really anticipating was getting that windshield in, and that's all done, and that went together pretty good. So the next thing we got to work towards is getting the wings put on. I think the next thing I'm going to work on before I tackle that is working on these wing struts here. I took those off and just took them off from the fuselage and the wings and left the jury struts and everything on them. And I just had them stored above the wings until I took the wings out of here, and then they were just leaning up against the wall. But I think I'm going to go ahead and take those apart, take the jury struts off and everything, and clean all that stuff up. There's too much chance when I start moving this stuff around of bending something there on those jury struts. But I also need to go over all that, clean up all the peralcatone on there. All the fittings are just caked in peralcatone, so I need to get that stuff cleaned up and go over those and check them out for any cracks, any defects in the paint, any rust, and get any of that taken care of before we go any farther on there. I bought those a few years ago. I wanted to get ones from Airframes Alaska because I know they were put theirs together. They do pretty good quality control on them. Well, they didn't have them available at the time. I wound up buying them from Univair, and my experience with Univair is not very good. They don't do very good quality control on their parts. These struts had a real heavy coating of red oxide primer on them, and I stripped that down pretty good, and there was pits and stuff in the raw metal underneath. That's kind of why I got to watch those real close, is not only do they get the scratches and stuff from wear and tear from everyday use, but they also come pre-contaminated from the manufacturer. We got the jury struts taken off of those. They're just held together with some AN3 bolts, and I moved these up here on the sawhorses so they're underneath these heaters. And now I'll go to the trouble of scraping the peralcatone off of them. It's gooped on there pretty good on these forks, on these bolts down here on these forks. I get the wing struts stripped down, got all of the peralcatone cleaned up off of them pretty well. The forks look really good. The peralcatone kept those cleaned up really good. They're just like new. A little bit disappointed in the rest of the struts there. I knew I was going to have a few places on there that need to be cleaned up, places where the paint had scratched and maybe where there was a little bit of rust starting. And I was kind of figuring I'd get those cleaned up and sand those down and do some spot repairs on it. But after I got it cleaned up and got to looking, it not as nice as what I had hoped. I've got rust breaking out on the trailing edges of those struts, pretty much along the full length of that, the right main wing strut and the left rear strut and then the left front strut. They're going to take some work on those, and then there's a couple other places where it's coming through, not quite as bad as that. Pretty sure that it's not enough to condemn the struts, but I have to withhold judgment on that until we get them stripped down and get them cleaned up and see exactly how bad they are. So I'm going to have to do a little bit more than just some spot repairs on there. I think I'm going to sand those all down, scratch sand them all down, and then clean up all those little nicks and chips and stuff, and the places where the rust is coming through is going to take a lot of work on that. Well, right here there's corrosion coming through it pretty good, a pretty good spot. Another one up here on this one. And then there's filiform corrosion. That's a little harder to see. Might be able to see it here on this, where this tube is. This is a tube that's welded on there for fair lead, and that's got some rust showing through the welds on that. But this is a filiform corrosion here. It's a streak coming out where the paint is blistered up on it, and the paint is so good on there that it doesn't allow the corrosion to break through, and it just creeps underneath the paint on the surface of the strut. So that'll have to be cleaned up. Similar over here, I've got a blister come out over here, and then we got streaks coming out here from that. And this inner strut here, this rear strut's the same way. I got streaks coming out of it off of this little patch of rust right there. Now those are not anything where there was a chip in the paint or anything like that where they got compromised and got rust in there. There's not any fault in the paint application, anything like that. That is all from the company that built the struts using subpar material. Now, I'm sure this material meets the specs for Piper for the struts for the lifetime struts. I'm sure the material meets that, but leave it sit out in the weather and stuff and let it get rusty, and then make a part out of material that's already got rust on it and pits in it, and then paint over it. That to me is malfeasance, but that's what we got there. Anyway, that's going to take a lot more work than I'd hoped it would. Oh, I'm pretty disgusted right now. I decided to go ahead and start cleaning up these struts. I figured I'd scratch sand them down and then sand down all these places where the rust is coming out and clean those down to bare metal, make sure it was good and clean. I started on this one here, this small one, which is the right rear strut. Thought it would just be an easy one. I just scratch sand it down. There was a couple places where there was some nicks and chips in the paint. I figured I could just feather those out. None of the nicks or scratches or anything went down to the bare metal. They were just into the primer. Well, I got started on that, and as I started sanding those out, I could see through the red oxide here. You can see it right here. There's a little scratch here. Well, that's not a scratch from the external surface. That's something that was internal, and it caused the paint to come off right there. I found a whole bunch of spots in there where there were things like that, and as I started sanding down the trailing edge here, I started seeing more and more evidence of it where it was painted over dirty metal and pits, rust. So it's I'm pretty disgusted with it. Was a brand new part. When I got the struts new, I went over it with some sandpaper and sanded down the red oxide primer. It was a real thick coat of red oxide primer on these. Well, I sanded it down. There were a few places on there where once I sanded it and got the first coat off there, or part of the coat off there, I could see pits in some of these struts. So I sanded those out to bare metal, treated them, and then primed them and painted them over that. I thought I had the worst of it, or I probably did have the worst of it, but I thought I had all of it. But as I go through these, I can find rust spots and pits all over the place underneath this, even underneath the paint that is completely intact. There was no sign of any chips or breaks or anything like that in the paint. Well, this one here had no outside signs of any damage, except a couple chips in the paint that didn't go through the primer, and that was it. Kind of disgusting. Unhappy with that. So it's going to take a lot more work than I thought to get this thing going. I was thinking I could just clean these up a little bit, put them back on the airplane, put the wings on, put them back on the airplane, but it's going to take some work. So far on this one, there's nothing in there that is going to affect the structural integrity of the strut. It doesn't compromise the strength of the strut at all. We'll see how it goes with these other ones where I've actually got rust showing on them. But so far I don't think they affect the structural integrity of the struts. The strength of them. The initial sanding on the struts is done. I got the glaze broke all the way down it, and I got all the spots that had damage showing through sanded down to bare metal and feathered out pretty good. I started out using some 180 grit sandpaper, and that was working to get the glaze off and stuff, but just barely. It was loading up pretty fast, but it was just not good enough to get down where I had to feather out, get down to bare metal and go through the paint, the primer, and then the red oxide primer and the rust or whatever down to the bare metal. I had some 8-inch diameter sanding discs, 80 grit, that a friend left me. He ran a body shop here for years, did some auto body work and stuff. When he left town to make his fortune in multi-level marketing, he left some of this stuff with me that wasn't viable to sell. Well, anyway, I used that. I cut that up into quarter sheets and used that, and that worked pretty good. It still loaded up pretty fast, and I went through a whole bunch of it getting it down, but that was about the only practical way to get down through to the bare metal where those rust spots and stuff were. Well, it's a little bit rough from that. The 80 grit is a little bit rough, so I'm going to go ahead and go back over it again with 180 grit and smooth out the scratch marks and stuff in it, and then I'll see what I can do about treating those spots where the rust pits are in there. Well, those struts are all sanded down now, all smoothed out. I sanded them down with 180 grit sandpaper. That smoothed them out pretty good. Got all the scratches from the 80 grit out of them, so they're polished up pretty good. And I got to find some rust conversion of some kind to treat those bare metal spots before I paint them. And then I'll have to make me a paint booth here and figure out how to get it warm enough to paint in here. I took some Coraceal and spread out on those bare spots that I'd sanded through. The Coraceal is a conversion coating, and it actually converts the rust to an inert substance, and then you can paint over it. It has some kind of acids in it that react with the rust, and then it has polymers in it that make a coating like a paint. You use it as an undercoat and primer. Anyway, I spread that out on all of the bare spots there, and that has turned black there where it's coated, reacted with the metal. It actually reacts better with lightly rusted metal, slightly oxidized metal. It reacts with the oxides, and it doesn't react very well with bare steel. Anyway, that stuff is on there. I've got to let it dry. This temperatures would probably take a couple days to get thoroughly cured, and then I'll sand it down smooth and get ready to paint over it with the primer. I went out, dug out my stands out of the snowbank. They were out there buried in the snow. I used those this summer to make a hanger to hang up the control surfaces, the horizontal stabilizers and stuff. That's what I hung those from. But I'd set those up before when I bought these struts new. I set those up to paint the struts on, to hold them on. So I'll get those set up to do that again if I can remember how to do it. I got the shovel out and dug the wings out of the snowbank too. It's going to be a few days before I'm ready to bring those in here, but got them dug out of the snowbank and ready. I got to dig the paint out. I took some of it out already out of the shop and take it up to the basement so it can get warmed up enough to mix and use. I don't have enough firewood left to get fires going in the shop to get it heated up, so I'll take it up to the basement. The struts are all sanded down now. Got that Coraceal sanded down. That stuff is a pain to sand. It really loads up the sandpaper fast. Finally got smart and took some MEK on a rag and wiped down the excess of it where it ran and the high spots and stuff like that. The only place I really needed it was in that bare metal where the rust pits and stuff were. Anyway, those are all sanded down. They look pretty good. I've just wiped them down with some paint thinner. Now, it hasn't been too bad here lately. It's been warming up in the daytime. I actually got, I think, 35 today, or a little better. It was 40 yesterday. It's supposed to start cooling off again now. Been getting down to 20, low 20s at night, but that's a lot better than what it has been. If I get someplace closed off in here to do that paint, I can hold enough heat in there that I can get the paint cured on it. But before I do anything else, I've got to go over to a friend of mine's hangar. He's out of town. He's been sick. I've got to go check his hangar out. I went over there the other day to check it out, but the snow was piled up around the door and I couldn't get in, so I've got to take a shovel over there and shovel out, get the door open, so I can get in and check everything out there.